Hi everyone, this is Nikki and welcome back to the Fundamentals of Print Design. In this lesson, we're going to go a step further into this current design where we previously talked about all of the design elements that make up this design and any other print project. And now we're going to talk about the guidelines used to create the design using those elements. And the guidelines I'm talking about are the principles of design. Now, what's important to note about the principles of design is they are applied to every print project, and how you apply them is what determines how visually successful your design ends up being. So let's go ahead and jump right into our design here, and I'm going to show you how all of the elements on this page relate to the principles of design. And this is in no particular order, but we're just going to go through this list. All right, the first principle of design is unity. Now, when we're talking about unity, we're talking about a visual unity of all of these elements and how they work together to create a look that matches. So there's a lot of different things that apply to unity. In particular, we're talking about proximity, similarity, any sort of repetition or rhythm, and then any variations in your theme. So the proximity is obviously how close together all of your items are. Physically close, if they're physically close, they tend to be related. If they're far apart, you wouldn't think of them as a sort of relationship. For example, this up here is pretty far from down here. So visually, you're separating those. However, it's unified in your overall image, but they're not necessarily really close together in proximity. Not nearly as close as, say, these items. So these have a much more unifying look than something far apart, but you're still thinking about that overall unity. Similarity, again, those items that are very close together. You'll really see similarity when it comes to the way things are positioned, their size, their color, their shape, their textures. For example, in fonts, the similarity in fonts of your title here, these are the same font, and then you have a little contrast right there just to break up that visual unity. Any repetition in the same fonts, in the same colors, same thing for any patterns or other graphic elements that you repeatedly use. A good example of that is this area right here with our lines. We didn't just use it on top of the block quote. We also reversed it and put it at the bottom so you have some repetition in those lines. And then any other varying themes. Obviously, you can do this with any color or anything else that will draw your eye around and keep some visual interest. So the next item is point, line, and plane. Now it's kind of hard to talk about a plane when you're dealing with a 2D space. However, you're still looking at a flat object for your plane, so anything can really create a plane. Whether it's your lines and how they intersect or they don't intersect, all of that can create a visual plane in your overall image. And we have a lot of that here with these lines. So there's several planes going on and they work together with line. So you can have a physical line or you can have an implied line like you have here, which is with the negative space of your 2-column text and the lines around your text. So again, you can have a real physical line or an implied line of how you use your negative space. Strokes are also a form of line, for example, on your text. And then points can be anything from the smallest of small point on your image, like these dots here, to bigger circles or bigger items in your text. The next item we have is balance, and balance is what I would call that happy place between a little bit of tension and everything working very nicely together to create a sense of calm. One way to throw off your balance, and I discussed this in the previous lesson, is to crowd your items too close together or too close to the edge. For example, if I was to take this all the way here, right away, that throws off the sense of balance and calm by having that all the way to the edge. And the neat thing about balance and that sense of calm and that sort of unified visual element is that you physically have a reaction to something when it's off balance. And you may notice this more than you think when you're critiquing a design, but it's something that you will physically notice with your eye when the balance is thrown off. So when it comes to balance, you can have your designs be symmetrical or asymmetrical. Symmetrical obviously is when you have something that's the same on both sides. In this case, this would be an example of that. However, this drop cap throws that symmetry off a little bit, but you do have symmetry in your text here, as well as symmetry in these three blocks. Asymmetry is when you have something that is not symmetrical on both sides, and you don't always need to be going for a symmetrical look. That can get very dull and very boring. So throwing asymmetry in there is a good way to keep a visual interest in your design. You can also have a balance around a central item on your design, and that's called it's a radial balance. So you can focus on something and then everything around that kind of flows around that center element. And then you can have an overall balance, how everything works together. Does it work nice? Are you having a conflict because something's too close to the edge? Do you have too much on the page? So many times you are trying to throw in too many photos, too much text. Having this white space around the elements is so important for a successful balanced image. If you can keep it away, you don't need it, it's more important to throw it out than to try to fit it on the page. The next item is my most important item when it comes to the principles of design, and that is hierarchy. Hierarchy is that beautiful element that is useful in anything from your photo to your text. And when I'm talking about hierarchy, I'm talking about having an equal balance of your items, but when I say equal, I don't mean the same size. You have this great balance. However, you have a varied degree of sizes. And you can see this here with a large headline, followed by a much smaller subline in this article. And then you have smaller text. But you don't just have it in one block. It's separated into two columns. And then you have a bigger block quote that happens to be in a different color. And the same thing down here. You have a bigger title for this section followed by smaller text. And another way to bring that hierarchy into play is to use different fonts. Most of the time I like to use a sans serif for my bigger headlines because it's easier to read, followed by a serif font for text. Now that can be reversed to where you have a serif headline and a sans serif body text. But that helps with the hierarchy along with size. So hierarchy is so important, and just to give you a taste of that, I'm going to go off the pasteboard here and just drop in some filler text. And right away, this is text without any type of hierarchy. And I'm not even paying attention to our overall content at the moment. We're just looking at the visual. But if I was to just all of a sudden start creating a sense of hierarchy just by taking my paragraphs and giving some title, I'm just picking this out here as you can see, but just doing that already created a huge difference in hierarchy. Not to mention if you were to take that a step further and changing the color of our headlines just to give an idea. See, that's what hierarchy is. You're making that important element stand out, the less important content go back a little bit, and in the end, you have something that is a lot to read, and it gives that viewer something to look at without looking at the whole page, basically looking at the whole page the same. So hierarchy to me is the most important principle of design. The next thing is scale, which goes right into hierarchy. Scale is the size of your elements and how they relate to each other. So we touched on that a little bit with hierarchy, but your scale is the difference between your headlines, your filler text, block quotes, anything on the page. Your photos, for example, these are two very different, actually all of these photos are different sizes, but that creates that visual hierarchy that we're looking for, but it also adds to that sense of balance. So you're seeing that there's a lot of comparison already to our principles of design. They work very well together. And then along with scale, you have dominance. Now, dominance is what you get when you bring in those contrasting elements of color and size and how you position them, their style, their shape, all focal point. So if you were to look at this page the way that it is, and I were to ask you what the focal point of this is, the very first thing your eye sees, more than likely, it's going to be that giant title, At Home with the Larrabees. That's going to be your focal point, and that's the title of your article. So that's really what you want to be the focal point of this. Now, that could change depending on what your overall piece is. In this case, it's a magazine article, so it's going to be the title. But then again, you have a following dominance with your images, your block quote, your big title of what the section is, followed by the very last part, that featured profile at the bottom. So you're looking for that focal point, and that really helps you when you design, focus on what's important. Whatever your focal point is, everything else is scaled around that to create a visual contrast in all of your elements, which then by default leads to similarity and contrast. The key thing about similarity and contrast is you're always telling yourself, what can I bring together? But then it's, again, what can I kind of keep separate visually? So we have matching colors, we have matching shapes, we have similar photos, we have white space that's equally used throughout, but at the same time, we have contrasting colors in our title, contrasting colors all the way throughout, but they do work together even though they're contrasting. By that, you don't just have, for example, all black. All of your text is black, all of your squares in here, your shapes are black, your colors in your photos are black and white. You have some contrast in those colors to make them visually pop. And at the same time, it's super important to keep things very simple, and you're not overwhelming your image with way too much clutter and everything looks together in one big lump and you can't tell the difference between your headline and your body text. You want to keep it simple, and you want to remember that hierarchy, and you want to build something unique. So if you're going to be using some similar fonts, keep those in mind because you may be using that same font throughout. Things of that nature really helps with that similarity and contrast. So while you're trying to keep things very unified and very simple, you're also figuring out ways to throw some contrast in there to keep things interesting. And you can do that through space. Is it empty? Is it filled? Is your photo near to you, far away? For example, you can see these guys' faces here, but it's a little harder to see them there, but there's a visual interest there. Are you going to use 2D versus 3D elements? How are you going to position those elements? The direction that they're facing, their overall structure. For example, structure for me in fonts, are you going to use a serif versus a sans serif? That's not necessarily a choice. You can use both, but how you use them is key. Your size, big versus little, long versus short, color, light versus dark, grayscale versus color, warm colors versus cool colors. And here we have both. We have a blue and a warm color of a magenta here. So again, it's not a choice of one or the other, but how they work together. And are you going to use thick strokes or thin strokes? Lines, same thing. Are you going to use a lot of elements close together? Or are you going to spread things out a little bit? All of these things help with that similarity and contrast. So it's really neat to think of it in one element versus the other and make choices based on that. And the final two items that we have is our movement and our rhythm and pattern. Now these work together because your rhythm and pattern actually works to create movement. So basically, however you're laying your item out on the page is going to dictate that movement of the eye and the size of your image, what's in your image. For example, these guys facing off the page creates movement for your eye, how your eye circles through here, and then any sort of rhythm or repeating patterns that create a visual texture will help with that. Now that you have an understanding of what exactly goes into a print composition through the elements of design and the principles of design, it's time to look at some common mistakes people make when using those together. So stay tuned for our next lesson. Thanks for watching.